Hi, my name is Dana Golden, and welcome back to our look at commodity markets. Today, we're going to be talking about agricultural commodities and the Outlook program. So, agricultural commodities are used for sustenance, but also for other purposes. Obviously, food is a major part of the agricultural system, but you also need cotton for clothes, and you need other um, agricultural products for other uses. Cows can help make leather. So, uh, agricultural commodities are distinct from most other commodities in that they're perishable and highly dependent on weather patterns, creating some pretty significant risk. When I was interviewing for the USDA a number of years ago, my interviewer, Susan Thornsberry, who was a great economist, who's now doing extension work down in Florida, she talked about like the role of risk in agriculture, and if you want to really understand risk, come work in agriculture. So agriculture commodities fall into three main categories: grains, softs, and livestock and animal products. Grains are cereals and legumes. Cereals include wheat, rice, and maize, and legumes include soybeans and lentils. And then softs include cotton, cocoa, fruit, and coffee, things like that. So there's a broader division here that is also important to mention. So grains and softs aren't the only division. You can also divide crops into field crops and specialty crops. So, for instance, cocoa and coffee and fruit are specialty crops. Almonds are a specialty crop, and wheat, soybeans, cotton, and corn are all field crops. And the difference is that field crops you grow in rows and you grow a lot at one time. You have to harvest a lot of it. It's kind of a mass production exercise. And then every small part of it is worth a small amount, so you have to harvest a lot to make any money. With specialty crops like cocoa and almonds, there's a pretty significant worth to any individual one. It's like a single, a good example of a specialty crop is an orange. I have never paid for a single grain of rice. I don't think any of you have either. I don't think any of us have ever bought a single kernel of corn. We've all bought a single orange. So we all roughly know that oranges are not expensive, but they're not like free. And that's what makes specialty crops different. And that's why California is an agricultural powerhouse. Is not because they have so much farming. California is not a major farming place. There's not tons of farming, but the crops they grow out in California are all specialty crops, which are incredibly expensive. And of course, there's livestock. Livestock is I've never been a livestock analyst. I know very little about livestock, but my understanding of livestock is that it's very hard to trade because it's very difficult to make any two livestock similar enough to produce a futures market. I mean, we have futures for cattle, and we have futures for wool and whatnot, but it's a difficult thing. This is why most of this is sold at auction. And if you look at the Agricultural Marketing Service, they have some really great auction data on cattle. So the Midwest is a place where they grow corn and soybeans. If you hit wheat, you've gone too far west. If you hit cotton, you're in the South. So I'm from the South. I'm from Georgia. We traditionally were a pretty big cotton state. That's not really true anymore. Now we're actually the country's leading producer of poultry, and we produce a lot of peaches. We're not really a cotton state anymore. I guess, fortunately, I'm not a particular fan of cotton as a crop. So here you can see corn, a lot of it going on in the Midwest. And then here you have soybeans, also a very Midwestern crop. So I used to work with a guy named Todd Hubbs. Todd Hubbs was the cross commodity analyst, really smart guy. just a really bright analyst, and he would tell me that farmers love, so interestingly enough, soybeans and corn effectively grow the same way. They're very similar crops in terms of growth. Most farmers are growing both. They have very different price ranges, and they have very different. They have very similar climates, but they have different price ranges. They have different ways you have to market them. But if you'll notice, corn grows in way more places than soybeans. So what's that about? Why aren't we growing soybeans in all these places? There are some climate reasons, but the main reason is that farmers like growing corn. Todd said to me, if you give Midwestern farmers a chance to grow corn, they're going to do it because they're good at it and they enjoy it. Yeah, Midwestern farmers feel the same way about growing corn that I feel about analyzing data. They're good at it. It makes them feel good. If you can give Midwestern farmers a basis they want, they'll grow as much corn as they want. Soybeans don't have that same love. Soybeans are very difficult. It's not a fun crop for the farmers I know to grow usually. Most of them like corn. So here's oilseeds crops. Oilseeds are weirdly in the news lately, which is kind of odd as someone who has watched this market for years, and they were in the news when I was watching this market because there was a U.S.-China trade war, and the United States was having tariffs placed on its soybeans, which was hurting the Midwestern farmers. And so China and the United States made a deal, so China would buy our soybeans if we would lift some of the trade policies on them. This was deliberately designed to hurt Trump's rule base. Because soybeans are a major instrument of American foreign policy. So if you see here, America grows a lot of soybeans. China also does, but they just consume so many more, so they actually import tons of soybeans from the United States. And then here we have Brazil and Argentina are our main competitors. Actually, I think, Brazil for a few years has been the world's largest soybean exporter. We've lost our crown. But yeah, oil crops are now in the news as a production good. Yeah, Bobby Kennedy, RFK, just going around saying, we gotta stop seed oils. And yeah, it's a very interesting thing, seeing these 32 very odd crops that range from olive oil to soybean oil to canola oil become national news. It's very weird, but yeah, I can see where he's coming from. So what makes a soybean different is, what makes an oilseed different rather is, and obviously soybeans are the largest oilseed, so they're kind of a leader in this space. But what makes oilseeds different is that there are so many of them, and when you get an oilseed like a soybean, you crush it, and so when you crush it, you create oil, soybean oil, which is in most of our foodstuffs. There are a lot of complex reasons we won't get into as to why that is happening. And then you get the protein. So this is actually why animal feed is rated in terms of soy meal equivalent. So you get soy meal protein, which is the traditional protein that you're putting in food for vegetarians, and also animal feed. And then you get the oil. And then what determines how efficient this process is the how much is left over after you crush, based on what was left over at the beginning, and based on whether or not soy meal or soy oil is more valuable, you will either see more meal produced or more oil produced, and that's the soy crush ratio. So this food dollar. One of the interesting things about the food dollar is that very little of the dollar that you spend on food is going towards farmers. So farm production gets 7.6 cents of every dollar. It used to be less. This is like a rise in the last few years. Assuming I've gotten these numbers from the right source and they're recent. Check ERS's website. But food processing is substantially more than farm production, transportation, packaging, wholesale. Wholesale is also more than farm production. Food services like restaurants and retail trade are a lot of it. Those farmers, they're growing the food. They're getting a very small amount of the food dollar. And there are a lot of reasons why that happens. But it is, it's a hard life being a farmer. So this is the U.S. agricultural trading balance. Agricultural goods were, for a long time, one of the goods where the United States traditionally had a major export surplus. In my lifetime, it's kind of always been like we were a major agricultural exporter. We exported more food than we were importing, partially thanks to California, a massive export operation going out there on the West Coast. Now, actually, we're no longer an agricultural net exporter. But weirdly enough, we're a energy net exporter. So we used to import all this energy and worry about that. And now we're exporting tons of energy, which I'm very happy about. But also, unfortunately, we're a net food importer. And this has to do with the rise of the value of the currency. As the United States currency appreciates, our exports become more expensive, which makes our goods less desirable and makes people buy less of our soybeans. And then also some of the crops that are from other regions have become comparatively more expensive, but are still bought in the United States. Not comparatively more expensive because they had currency appreciation, but comparatively more expensive because the price went up. And that's shifted the agricultural trading balance. And we'll see later on whether this trend continues. So some features of commodity markets is that they're volatile and susceptible to long cycles. One of the things I think a lot of people don't realize is that commodities, even though you think of commodities as a very basic instrument, agriculture is probably the oldest industry. When we talk about human civilization, when we talk about the agricultural revolution, agriculture is driven, as well as energy and metals, are by capital investments. There's a capital investment cycle. This is less of an issue in agriculture than it is in metals and energy, but basically, it takes a while in metals and energy to respond to changing market trends, which generates what's called a commodity supercycle, which we'll talk about towards the end of the lecture. That's a significant contributor to supply chain issues because commodities are often, even though they're a small part of the overall value chain, like we saw with the food dollar, the producer of the commodity is not getting a ton of that dollar. You really can't replace them. You can't substitute away from oranges to something else, because if oranges are expensive, so are all the other citrus crops. And so are any other source of what you get from vitamin C. And it's hard to substitute away from commodities. There's no real substitute from lithium. They're highly reliant on physical activities. This is one of the few markets where you have a very strong tie between the physical market and the financial market, and they're highly risky with pretty significant hedging operations, which we'll talk about next time in our look at commodity market derivatives. So why are commodity markets interesting? Obviously, they're really the original market. Agriculture and metals predicted everything. There's this old meme online about a guy who had the oldest writing, and it was a complaint about the wrong grade of copper. This is something we've been doing forever. And if you'll notice, most of our models in principles classes are supply and demand, perfectly competitive markets. Doesn't make sense with most of the goods we're talking about now. So everyone's like, why are we studying these markets that never happen? commodity markets are where a lot of that happens, as where most of our economic theory developed, which is why if you look at the older economics texts, if you look at the Nobel Prize winners early on, a lot of those texts and Nobel Prize winners were looking at commodity markets. Probably the most prominent example is Clive Granger, who did a lot of great time series work. That's a Platonic idea of the market. Yeah, it's very useful for comparison, and you look at why other goods of other markets are not like commodity markets. There's a very interesting interaction and interplay between physical and financial markets, where you have a financial market that's really adapted to deal with very physical interactions. These are crucial to the development of developing countries. A lot of developing countries are highly dependent on commodities as sectors, and then over time they become less dependent. They're limited and non-renewable. Non-renewable is not really the case in terms of agriculture. You can always grow more trees unless you've lost the seeds to the trees or your atmosphere is destroyed. But like lithium, this is definitely true. We can't get more lithium unless we go to space. Maybe deep sea mining. And they also shape the geopolitical environment, as we talked about before. Energy is really at the heart of a lot of geopolitical events. And of course, they're central for all economic activities. You cannot do things without food. You can't build things without metals. And you can't run cars without energy. So even though they're generally a small part of the value chain, they're incredibly difficult to substitute away from, which makes them traditionally disproportionately party-end for macroeconomic risk, because shifts in commodity market prices, even if they're small, are very difficult to diversify away from because you need the commodities. So I'll talk for a moment about the Great Grain Robbery. The Great Grain Robbery refers to a series of large covert purchases of grain by the Soviet Union in 1972, which significantly impacted global agricultural markets. Poor Soviet harvests in the 1970s created a massive shortfall in domestic grain supply. U.S. agricultural policy at the time subsidized grain exports, making American grain relatively cheap. So what happened in the Great Grain Robbery is Soviet trading companies acting covertly purchased 10 million tons of American grain. The purchases were executed quickly and below market prices without alerting U.S. authorities or the market. And the scale of the purchases caused a sharp increase in global grain prices when discovered. And then U.S. taxpayers effectively subsidized Soviet purchases through export programs. So the Soviets misrepresented how much grain they were buying, and they misrepresented how much grain they needed, and then they subsidized the purchase of Soviet goods because they were subsidizing farmers. Domestic grain prices skyrocketed because we had a shortage. This led to inflation and financial strain for U.S. consumers, and highlighted vulnerabilities in U.S. grain export policies and lack of market transparency. This led pretty directly to what we know now as the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates, or the WASDE, which is a report that was established and after the Great Grain Robbery. This became a major goal of the federal government to have monthly forecasts for global agricultural production, consumption, trade, and stocks. Basically, for every major goods, the United States would know how much food it needed, how much food was out there, who was producing it, and if we were in trouble. Because if we don't have enough food, there's a problem. It increased transparency in U.S. and global agricultural markets. It provided timely data to prevent manipulation price shocks. Of course, you also have EIA, which publishes the annual energy outlook, which provides information on long-term energy trends, as well as the short-term energy outlook, which at the monthly level provides short-term energy trends. And then you also have weekly energy reports, like the natural gas report, the weekly electricity report, and the weekly oil report. So oil energy outlook helps provide comprehensive energy market analysis and projections, and focuses on long-term energy forecasts, including supply, demand, and pricing. So Outlook looks at what happened the previous year, explains the trends, and then talks about what goes forward. And then you have, of course, the USGS, United States Geospatial Services Mineral Commodity Summaries. These are annual and now monthly reports on domestic and international mineral production, consumption, and trade. They support critical mineral security and planning. They monitor global supply chain disruptions. So now the last thing I want to talk about in this intro to commodity markets is the role of the market balance sheet in commodity markets. Commodity market balance sheet is a detailed presentation of supply, usage, demand, and stocks for a specific period, typically 1 year. One of the interesting things about commodity market balance sheets is that the balance sheet is the market. If you have this balance sheet, you know what the price is, you know what the supply is, you know what the demand is, and you're pretty able to figure out what's going on in the market. So components, supply, beginning stocks, production levels, and imports. So what's coming into the country and what's available to start. And then demand, domestic consumption, exports, and ending stocks. And with these things, you can back out the amounts of different goods. The balance sheet provides a comprehensive overview of the commodity market dynamics and assists in forecasting price movements by analyzing supply and demand imbalances and informs policy decisions and strategic planning for stakeholders. WASD is a good example of monthly balance sheet for commodities with supply and usage variables. And the significance of balance sheet is that it helps highlight potential shortages and surpluses. It helps guide traders and investors in making informed decisions. It reflects the impact of external factors like weather and policy changes on the commodities market. So here is the U.S. soybean production, supply, and use. So you have area planted and area harvested. Those are variables that go into production. You have a yield per harvested acre, which is the amount you're producing by every acre. If you multiply this, so you have planted, you have slightly less, and that's going to be harvested. And then you have a yield per harvested acre. You multiply this number by this number, you'll get production. You have an amount of stocks, and then you have an amount of imports. You add production, you add stocks, you add imports. That's supply. And then on the other side of the market, you have crushings, which is the demand for oil to be crushed. You have exports, which is foreign demand for oil seeds. You have seed, which is the demand for basically soybeans to plant. And then you have residual. Residual is always a funny thing. Basically what residual means is that something doesn't add up. We don't know what's going on with these 39 million bushels of soybeans. So this is really the way you calculate residual is you get supply, you get demand, and you subtract the two, and you get this number. And sometimes this is negative, which ends up being very funny. There's a negative demand for soybeans, which is residual. But you have to make these two things balance because otherwise the market won't work. And if these two things don't balance, that means your statistics are wrong, and they'll work very quickly to make those match. Not that it's anyone's fault the statistics are wrong, it's just hard to create these statistics. So use total, you add up all these numbers, and then you get ending stocks, 264, which is supply. So we have supply minus demand plus beginning stocks equals ending stocks. So this is the amount you have left at the end of the period. So beginning stocks, how much you have left at the beginning. Ending stocks, how much you have left at the end. This is a really low ending stock number. Traditionally, this was back in 2022. We were really worried about soybean stocks back then. There were very few. This number almost went to zero. And the reason why ending stock is so important is because they help set the price. If you look at this average farm price per bushel, it's kind of high. It's significantly higher than in any of these next 2 years. And if that stock number gets to zero, you have a stock out, which means you just don't have enough soybeans to go around, which was the problem with the Great Grain Robbers. We effectively had a stock out. And when you have a stock out, the prices skyrocket. So if you're a commodity analyst, you always want to be watching your commodity stocks and understanding if there's going to be enough to go around, because stocks don't matter when you have tons of stocks, but when you have very few stocks, they matter a great deal, and the prices skyrocket. And you might wonder, one last thing to mention here, and then I'll let you go. How can you have this residual if you have ending stocks? Isn't ending stocks just solved for? Actually, no. Ending stocks is not solved for based on all these other variables. We have data on beginning stocks. We have data on ending stocks. These both come from the National Agricultural Statistics Service. In energy, these come from EIA. All this data comes from EIA because there's a unified statistical service in energy. But you have data on ending stocks. You have data on beginning stocks. You have data on all these things except residual. So residual is actually the only number you need to back out here. And then farm price comes from survey data. And with that, I hope you have a great day. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed this. I certainly did. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.